Get your general manager caps ready for this one, folks. We are wheeling and dealing on behalf of the New York Islanders organization. This is what I have to say. What's next for the New York Islanders? I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because this is quite interesting. The second that Anthony Cirelli scored for Tampa Bay, I was excited because I wanted the Lightning to win. I considered them my second favorite team. Then once they're going through the awards and everything and getting the Prince of Wales trophy, I immediately started thinking, so now what for the Islanders? I realized that they are in a bit of a bind when it comes to this offseason, and they have some serious decisions to make. I put my Islanders hypothetical GM thinking cap on, and I came up with an interesting scenario where it involves a little bit of a blockbuster. There's a lot of moving parts. The New York Islanders have roughly $12.5 million or so in cap space for next year. Here's the thing, though. I'm sure Islanders fans already know this. Ryan Pulock, Devon Toews, and most importantly, Mathew Barzal, all three of those young players are restricted free agents. Now that the season's over, they're without a contract. The Islanders and Lou Lamoriello have to figure out how can they retain these three players, or this is where the hot take kind of comes in. Do they want to retain these players? I say that because this is pure speculation on my part. I'm not convinced that Matt Barzal is coming back next year. Most Islanders fans, I believe, would think, well, no, duh, he's going to come back. Obviously, he's such a key part of the offense. Yada, yada, yada. I would agree. I couldn't blame Islanders fans for wanting him back. I'm going to talk about why maybe he won't. I have read and heard speculation that Barzal and Barry Trotz don't really get along. I don't know if that's media creating a story that's not there, but from what I understand, Barry Trotz has obviously got a certain system, and it's sort of a my way or the highway kind of approach when it comes to his system. Barzal kind of has a freewheeling, explosive, speedy, dangle, stick handle kind of style game that doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the strongly disciplined structure that Barry Trotz likes to play. I've thought of a scenario that would allow the Islanders to retain a roster for next year that's not only close to as competitive as this current roster, but potentially better, and it allows them to retain Devon Toews and Ryan Pulock, who I think are actually more important to sign as they play defense. Barry Trotz is very adamant about defense. I think collectively, Pulock and Toews mean more to the success of the Islanders than Barzal. Here's what I had in mind for them. What do the Islanders need to do to be able to retain these two and also deal with potentially super expensive RFA Matt Barzal? First off, they need to clear cap space, which is obvious. I don't think all three players will be retained for that $12.6 million. If somehow Lou Lamoriello is able to do that, then I'm an idiot and he's a genius. Islanders fans, I'm sure, would be happy, and I would immediately project the Islanders as a playoff team next year. However, Lou Lamoriello does not generally break the bank to retain players, as good as they may be. I like Barzal a lot. I've talked about him on prior episodes. I think he has high upside. I think his game is definitely hindered a little bit by the fact that Trotz tries to get him to buy into his system, and I think the Trotz system, while effective, it definitely shelters high offensive talent to an extent. Barzal is a guy that's obviously shown flashes of incredible offensive output. His rookie year before Trotz got there, he had 83 points in 82 games. He's had strong showings with Trotz there. I believe he had 68 points in 82 games the year prior to this, and this year I believe he had 60 points in 68 games, which is very good. So even despite his offense being sheltered to an extent, he's still producing, and I think Barzal is the most dynamic offensive player they have. I'm not so sure Barzal necessarily wants to be stifled like that anymore. Maybe he does. Again, this is pure speculation on my part. It's just what I've heard from media outlets or read. It doesn't necessarily seem like Trotz and Barzal necessarily get along. I think they have a competitive understanding. I think they kind of coexist, so to speak, because as long as the Islanders were having success, that was all that mattered. Now that they've been eliminated by Tampa Bay, Barzal obviously being an RFA, he could potentially be the subject of offer sheet from other teams. The money it would probably take to coerce Barzal to sign away from the Islanders would probably be in the range of like 10 to 12 million average annual value or so. That's getting into the realm of 4 first-round draft picks. I don't think a team is going to be interested in giving up 4 first-round draft picks just for Barzal. Maybe they would. Maybe they consider him that good. However, I think Colorado could potentially be not only a suitor for Barzal where he would thrive, but I think they could make a blockbuster offer to the New York Islanders that sort of benefits both teams and allows the Islanders, like I said, to retain both Pulock and Taves. In this hypothetical blockbuster trade, they get just as competitive of a team. Here it goes. The 2 most hindering contracts that the Islanders have would be the Johnny Boychuk contract, which is a $6 million cap hit for the next 2 years, and the Andrew Ladd contract, which is $5.5 million for the next 3 years. Say that the Islanders package both of those contracts along with Matt Barzal, the principal point of return for Colorado in this case. There could be an exchange of arbitrary draft picks thrown in or what have you. I'm not going to speculate on that. I'm just going to talk purely in terms of player for player exchange. Whatever draft picks go in and out, I'm not going to pretend like I have an opinion on that. I would imagine on Colorado's end, they may need to include a first rounder to equal the value for Barzal. Here's why Colorado might be willing to take on Boychuk and Andrew Ladd. Johnny Boychuk is obviously a right shot D that Colorado desperately needs. They just had a playoff run where Eric Johnson went down with injury, and then all of a sudden their only right shot D was Cale Makar. I'm not saying Cale Makar is bad, but most teams want at least 2 right shot D if they can. Boychuk, although an expensive cap hit, Colorado with roughly, I think, 22 or so million, give or take, they can not only afford both contracts, but they could have use for a veteran guy like that. Boychuk doesn't necessarily have to play every game. He's that warrior-type player that every dressing room kind of wants if they want to make a deep run and need to plug somebody in here and there. Obviously, Boychuk isn't the fleetest of foot anymore. He doesn't skate super well. I'm not sure that he ever really did. He does still possess an absolute bomb of a shot. He does still possess that desire and grit. He's a guy that will hit. He's a guy that will block shots. He's still pretty strong defensively despite some skating deficiencies in his game. Obviously, at the advanced age, he's seen it all at this point. He's a great voice to have for somebody like Cale Makar or even Gerard. Some of these younger D that Colorado have, they could maybe use another veteran voice. Obviously, Colorado has Eric Johnson and Ian Cole. They've got some veteran guys. Why not add Boychuk if you can afford him? With only 2 years remaining, it's essentially, if he plays well for the year, then great. If it doesn't work out next year, if they totally flop and somehow don't make the playoffs or whatever, they come up short, with just the 1 year, it becomes a lot more feasible to buy out Boychuk. So it's not a high amount of risk bringing in a guy like that, even at such an expensive cap hit. It could potentially benefit Colorado having a guy like that, who I think still has some hockey left in him. I think he's going to have a fire to play. He obviously went down early on in the playoffs and didn't see much ice time until later on in the series against Tampa, and obviously now we know that the Islanders fell short. As far as Andrew Ladd, he had some action in one of the games against Tampa Bay. As far as I know, he's just had really bad luck with injuries. I think that's another guy who's a veteran presence. At $5.5 million, it's not necessarily ideal for the production that he's had over the last couple of years. He's a grittier guy that's won Stanley Cups, same as Johnny Boychuk, by the way. Johnny Boychuk was extremely instrumental in Boston's 2011 Stanley Cup championship. Andrew Ladd was a guy that was extremely instrumental in the 2010 Blackhawks Stanley Cup. I think that's the only one that Ladd won. I know that Chicago reacquired him for similar reasons as I'm citing now. In later playoff runs, I believe they came up short. But the point I'm making is Ladd and Boychuk, although between the two of them, they carry $11.5 million. I think they're veteran guys that a team that's a heavy contender like Colorado, it may behoove them to add them to the roster. Obviously, they're kind of doing the Islanders a favor taking those on. However, they're also gaining Barzal in this hypothetical scenario. And Colorado has the cap space to not only take on those contracts, but they could sign Barzal to a lucrative deal if they so desire. Now, when we're getting back to the return from Colorado, I believe there would probably have to be at least a pick or so, possibly their first rounder this year, which would be valuable because it's a very deep draft. Even though Colorado is going to have a later on pick, it's a fairly deep draft, so even a later pick could be of value to the New York Islanders. Here's where the blockbuster comes in. I believe, to make this work, Colorado could send Mikko Rantanen and all 9.25 of his contract back over the Islanders' way. Yes, I went there. I could be very crazy in proposing such a scenario. I don't blame you for thinking that, if that's what you're thinking right now, if you're an Islanders fan or a Colorado fan. I'd be very interested to know if there are Islanders or Avalanche fans listening to this. What do you think of this hypothetical scenario? I did the math. It would work out where, obviously, with bringing the 9.25 or whatever Mikko Rantanen's contract, I think that is ultimately less than what Barzal would need to be signed. That's a guy that I think has some high-end upside. He's obviously got more size than Barzal. The thing you're losing is Barzal is obviously a center. I think Barzal could actually be better suited with his skill set to not play center. As high end of upside as he has offensively, he's a guy that honestly struggles as a center. His defensive metrics have never been great. He's never been good at faceoffs. He's, I believe, 41 or 42% on faceoffs on his career, which is pretty terrible. So that's the real drawback of Barzal, is as a center, he's almost never winning the faceoff. Obviously, I've said this before, size isn't a skill, but Barzal is a guy that doesn't have size. You'd rather have a guy that's got it. That might be desirable for Lou Lamoriello and Trotz. That could be a guy that maybe fits what they want to do more. Like I said, given that more salaries leaving the Islanders' payroll and heading to Colorado, they can then turn around and sign Barzal because they're taking on an extra $2.5 million or so, 2.25 or so, but they still had that extra $20 million. And with the newfound cap room that the Islanders have in this proposed scenario, they have roughly 15 million, which should be plenty to re-sign not just Pulock, not just Devon Toews, but even potentially bring back fan favorite Matt Martin, who I'm sure would take a cheaper deal. He's a veteran guy. He likes it there. He's had success in the postseason for them. He's highly valued by them. He plays well with both Cizikas and Clutterbuck. I think he would take a cheap deal. He could easily be retained. They could also retain Derek Brassard, who's a UFA that they need to re-sign. And they could even retain Andy Green if he wanted to come back again. In losing Boychuk, they have Noah Dobson coming up from he just had his rookie season. He's still on an entry level. He's not obviously going to cost a whole lot of money against the cap for the next couple years. He's a guy I like a lot. Again, they're essentially replacing Barzal with Rantanen. Those are the principal two things involved in the trade. Another thing that's important to note with the Islanders, they do have Oliver Wahlstrom in their system. I think Bridgeport is one of the better developmental systems. If you just look at some of the defensemen that the Islanders have, like Pulock, like Pelech, like Devon Toews, other than Nick Leddy, obviously, Boychuk, I believe most of the main core of D have been drafted and developed through Bridgeport for them, which says a lot about the developmental capabilities. Wahlstrom, I believe, played pretty much all season in Bridgeport. He's obviously got a year of pro experience. He could have a good summer. He's still on that entry level. He's a guy that obviously has a good shot, decent skater. He's another offensive guy that if his game is able to be reeled in and molded into Trotz's system, they could essentially replace what they've lost and potentially be just as good, if not better, for next year. As far as replacing Thomas Greiss, the backup goaltender, I don't foresee them giving him an extension. They had drafted Ilya Sorokin, who, from what I understand, is going to be the heir apparent to Semyon Varlamov. Varlamov is signed long-term. Sorokin's got the one-year deal, but it's fairly cheap at $2 million. I think they'll go with the Russian tandem as their goaltenders. This is the scenario that I came up with. This is what I thought about most. In the immediate aftermath of the Islanders being eliminated, this is what came to my mind. I wanted to speak about it. What do Islanders and Colorado fans, or just hockey fans, anybody listening to this podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, comment, what do you think about it? Am I crazy? Am I onto something here? How likely is this to happen? Let me know in the comments who you think wins this trade. Let me know in the comments how you would amend this trade. Also, let me know in the comments, what teams would you want to see trade for Matt Barzal, if not the Colorado Avalanche? Islanders fans, how much do you think Matt Barzal is worth? How much, if you were the GM, would you pay Matt Barzal to guarantee that he is retained? Do you want to, for sure, retain Matt Barzal? Maybe you don't. Let me know in the comments below. Also, what teams would you want to see offer sheet Matt Barzal, which also ties into how much do you think Matt Barzal is worth? Thanks again, everybody, for listening. Be sure to subscribe to my podcast on Spotify, the Nathan Says Podcast, as well as on Apple at the Nathan Says Podcast. Click the bell button on YouTube so that you get updated every time one of my episodes goes up on YouTube. Thanks again, and we will see you all at the next episode.